She returned when autumn called her name. A quiet journey through forgotten streets, lost love, unfinished goodbyes, and the silent places where memory waited to be found. The air carried the scent of dry leaves and something quieter, like time standing still. Along the sidewalks of Sinsadong, the last of October's leaves had begun to fall, brushing against coats and shoes before drifting unnoticed onto the pavement. Jiwon stepped out from the subway and paused just beyond the turnstiles. Her bag rested against her hip. She stood still for a moment, allowing the noise of the city to wash over her, not to overwhelm her, but to remember it. It had been 10 years. She walked through streets once familiar, now touched by change. The cafes had new signs, the trees along the boulevard looked more trimmed than before, and the crosswalks buzzed with a faster rhythm. Still, the bones of the city were the same. Its core had not shifted, even as the details had. The reason for her return wasn't planned. A letter had arrived at her apartment in Busan, its envelope marked with handwriting she hadn't seen in years. There was no greeting, no explanation. Only a line that read, "He kept everything you left behind." She didn't read it twice. The apartment was tucked behind a weathered bookstore in Apgujeong, one she had visited often in her early 20s. A narrow staircase led to the second floor, its banister polished smooth by the years. The same owner stood behind the register below, older now, but still silent and alert. He handed her the key without questions, as though time had paused just long enough for her to return. She climbed the stairs slowly, one hand brushing the wall beside her. The door at the top clicked open with a soft creak. Light fell across the floor in long lines, filtered through half-drawn curtains. Dust floated in the air. The apartment smelled of old paper and wood varnish. No signs of recent use, but no signs of neglect either. The furniture remained as she remembered it. A low table by the window, a stack of books that leaned slightly against the wall, a narrow bed covered in a faded gray sheet. The easel stood near the window untouched, a pencil still resting along the tray. The sketchbooks were stacked carefully on a nearby shelf. They were clean, unbent, and waiting. Jiwon moved through the apartment in silence. Her hand ran lightly over surfaces, brushing away a layer of dust as she went. The silence wasn't unfamiliar. It had been a constant companion for years. Yet here, it felt different. Not heavy, not empty. Just a present. She opened one of the sketchbooks and sat on the floor, cross-legged. The pages smelled faintly of charcoal. The first few drawings were of places she remembered well. An overpass near Dongdaemun, the railing of a pedestrian bridge, and a quiet alleyway near the riverbank. His lines were clean, even restrained. There was a clarity to them that hadn't existed in the early days of his work. Turning the pages, she found sketches of her. Never direct portraits, he never drew her face. But her shape was there, the curve of her back as she sat at the piano. Her hands resting on the edge of a bench, the shadow of her coat in the rain. He had captured not her likeness but her presence. Each image brought back something small. The way she used to tilt her head when listening. How she sat slightly turned when reading, one leg tucked under the other. The quiet moments, the ones they never spoke of but always remembered. Near the end of the book, the drawings shifted. The strokes became uneven. The spacing grew wider. A page would hold only a few lines, a door frame, a coffee cup. The spine of a book was left on the floor, as if he had started to forget or had grown uncertain of what to draw. The final page was almost empty. In the corner, a closed umbrella leaned against a wall. She closed the sketchbook and set it aside. In the corner of the room, near the door, stood the same umbrella. Faded black, with a wooden handle. She had forgotten it the morning she left. Rain had fallen steadily, and she had taken another one instead. She remembered how he had held it for her while she adjusted the strap on her bag. She had said nothing as she stepped away, and he hadn't followed. But the umbrella had remained. She picked it up now. The fabric was worn at the edges, and the metal frame was slightly bent. Still it opened. Slowly it opened. That night she didn't sleep. She lay still, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. The sound of a passing bus below marked the hour. She counted each one, listening for the hum that faded just as quickly as it arrived. The past had begun to stir, but not in sharp flashes. It returned softly, like an old tune she didn't realize she remembered. The next morning she walked to the Han River. The path beside the water was mostly empty, except for a few joggers. The air was cool, the kind that filled the lungs without force. She kept the umbrella closed, carrying it by her side. The river moved quietly. Birds flew low across the water. A few leaves floated near the bank. She found the same bench they used to sit on. It hadn't changed, though the paint had chipped along the edges. She sat and watched the water, the buildings across the river half shadowed by the clouds. There was no rush to remember anything. The memories came on their own. There had never been a specific moment when they became distant. No argument. No final word, just time moving forward as it does, and their paths splitting gradually without intention. She had been offered a teaching opportunity in Jeonju. He had stayed for a gallery exhibit. They had written less often, then stopped altogether. When she moved to Busan, she told no one. Yet some part of her had expected he might reach out. Even years later, she sometimes caught herself checking her phone at night, long after she had stopped waiting. It wasn't hope, just a habit. She stayed on the bench until the sky began to shift. The umbrella rested on her lap, unopened. The river kept flowing. Later that day, she opened the closet. Inside were his coats, still hanging in order. Shoes neatly arranged along the floor. On the top shelf, she found a small, familiar box. A square wooden case she had given him once. Inside, carefully arranged, were small keepsakes, a concert program from her first recital, a keychain from a trip they took during winter, a folded note she had written on the back of a receipt, her name in his handwriting, written at the edge of a photo. These weren't things of value, not to anyone else, but to him they had been enough to keep. She returned the items to the box, closed the lid, and left it on the windowsill. That evening, she made tea. The kettle was slower now, but it still worked. She sat on the floor beside the window and looked through another sketchbook. This one held more abstract lines, less form, and more motion. It had likely been his later work. She had not seen these before. She turned page after page, noting how the lines repeated, how a certain curve returned again and again, like a signature beneath something unfinished. The drawings reminded her of how he used to speak about time, never in seconds or minutes, but in moments. He used to say that some things couldn't be captured by clocks, only by presence. Outside, the streetlights began to glow. The city below moved on without her. She didn't mind. She hadn't come to be seen, only to see what remained. On her final morning, she walked to a hill just outside the city, quiet and less developed. A small cemetery sat beneath a tall maple tree. There was no headstone, just a flat plaque pressed into the ground. His name, his birth and death years, and a brief note beneath. He drew things as they were, and sometimes as he hoped they would be. She stood there for a long time. The breeze moved gently through the grass. Leaves drifted down in slow, uneven spirals. Insects buzzed softly at the edges. In the distance, the outline of a crane moved slowly above a construction site. Life continued beyond that small, quiet plot. She didn't leave flowers, just her presence. When she returned to the apartment, she gathered only a few items, a sketchbook, the box, and a scarf she had once left behind. She cleaned the surfaces, folded the blankets, and made the bed. She left the umbrella standing by the door, exactly where she had found it in the drawing. Before she left, she opened the window once more. The air smelled of leaves and dust and something unspoken. She placed a folded note beside the sketchbooks. Nothing long, just a few lines. She didn't need to say more. There was no one left to read it, and that made the act all the more honest. As she walked down the stairs and onto the street, the city met her with indifference. It did not remember her, but she remembered it, and that was enough. Her train left in the afternoon. She sat by the window, her bag at her feet, the sketchbook resting on her lap. The city shrank behind her slowly, then all at once. She didn't look back, not out of resolve, but because there was no need. The past had not disappeared, it had settled, and now, so had she. Winter passed without ceremony, soft and gray, like the final notes of a forgotten song. Jiwon remained in Busan, living in quiet intervals between teaching part-time at the art center and long walks by the sea. Her drawings had returned, not in full, not as the intricate work she had once created, but as sketches of light, motion, and stillness. Each morning she rose before dawn. Her apartment, small and high enough to see the horizon, became a kind of refuge. The past no longer struck her with the same sharpness, but it had not vanished. It clung instead like mist, present, formless, always near. Her old life was not something to be escaped, only carried. In February, she received a message from the gallery. They offered her a corner exhibit, something modest. She agreed after little thought, not out of ambition, but out of the need for direction. She began collecting her drawings, ones she'd done without intention, scattered across her desk and drawers. Most were half-finished. None bore titles. By early March, the gallery confirmed the date. She selected 14 pieces and mailed them in simple frames. That same week, she found herself returning to the scarf once more, the one she'd taken from the apartment. Folded and worn, its edges frayed. She wore it when the wind picked up, not out of sentiment, but because it still held warmth. The sea remained her sanctuary. On a pale, rainy afternoon, she wandered past the harbor and reached the trail she hadn't walked since last spring. There was a bench overlooking the waves. She sat there for some time, sketchbook on her lap, pencil unmoving. Her breath came slow, her eyes fixed not on the water but on the sky above it, a dull stretch of silver streaked with gray. Somewhere nearby, gulls cried against the wind. It was there, in that quiet moment, that her chest tightened. It began as a small discomfort, like cold settling deep beneath the ribs. Then the pressure grew sudden, sharp, and hollowing. She remained still, unsure of whether it was fear, grief, or something else. She pressed her hand to her heart. The sensation passed, but something had changed. She went home and didn't draw that night. For the first time in months, her sleep was interrupted not by dreams, but by a hollow awareness in the dark. A quiet alarm in her body had sounded without reason. She didn't tell anyone. There was no one to tell. A week later, she collapsed while walking home from the gallery. The passers-by who found her called for help. She was admitted to the hospital in the early evening, her sketchbook found clutched in her bag, pages slightly damp from the afternoon rain. The doctors quickly found it to be an aggressive form of cardiomyopathy. It explained the fatigue, the tightness, and the fainting. There were treatment options, they said, medications, procedures, but none promised certainty. When asked if she had family, she wrote a single name on the intake form. It was crossed out almost immediately. For the first time in years, she was forced to confront the body she had neglected, the quiet ways it had been failing her, and the silence she had mistaken for strength. Her solitude, once chosen, had become a quiet barrier against help. The gallery called, unaware. Her work had arrived. The exhibition had been prepared. She thanked them in a short note. A friend from the art center volunteered to attend on her behalf, placing a photograph of her at the exhibit's edge, beneath a small card that read simply, G1 on leave. She remained in the hospital for nearly 3 weeks. During that time, she resumed sketching. Not on full sheets, but on the backs of test results, old envelopes, whatever she could reach. The nurses began collecting them in a folder, unsure of what they meant. Most were abstract, fragments. Some were just lines drawn over and over again until they blurred. Spring bloomed outside the window. Cherry blossoms opened without waiting. One morning, she asked to be discharged. Her vitals were stable, but the doctors warned her again that rest was essential. She nodded, returned to her apartment, and began putting her things in order. She donated most of her belongings, books, furniture, and even her easel. The few boxes she kept held only essentials: sketchbooks, a worn sweater, the scarf, and her favorite cup. Her movements were unhurried, her expression unreadable. Those who saw her during this time said she looked lighter somehow, not in health but in bearing. It was early April when she took the train to Seoul again, her final visit. She didn't inform anyone. There were no appointments, no one to meet. She arrived in the afternoon and went straight to the river. The cherry blossoms had just begun to fall, their petals drifting down like snow. She walked the familiar path, her steps slow but steady. By sunset, she reached the bookstore building. It had changed, renovated, cleaner, stripped of its former weight. The apartment upstairs now bore a new nameplate. She didn't go in. Instead, she stood beneath the tree near the entrance. In her hands, she held a single sketch, the one she had drawn years ago but never displayed. It was abstract, almost empty. Just a few lines stretching toward the margin, like branches reaching for something that had already passed. She folded it once and tucked it behind the bricks near the wall. No one would find it easily. That, she thought, was the point. The next morning, she visited the hill behind the university, the one she and Min had gone to after the gallery years before. The climb took her longer this time. She stopped once halfway, pressing her palm against a railing, eyes closed. But she reached the top. From there, she saw the city stretched out below, its edges softened by morning haze, its sound muted by distance. Buses moved along the streets like veins carrying life. Children passed in groups, laughter echoing faintly even at that height. She sat on the bench and opened her sketchbook for the last time. The drawing was slow, not detailed, not precise, just motion. The curve of wind across rooftops, the suggestion of a figure walking alone. She drew until her hand trembled. Then she closed the book and rested it beside her. No one saw her leave the bench. A few days passed before a hiker found her. She had collapsed beneath the maple tree. Her body was still, her face peaceful. The scarf was wrapped neatly around her neck. Beside her, the sketchbook lay untouched. The authorities tried to contact next of kin. There was no one listed. The art center in Busan received the call. A colleague came to identify her. The funeral was small. The gallery offered to host a memorial. They displayed her 14 pieces one last time, with her final sketch placed at the center. The visitors who came left quietly. A woman left a single white lily. A boy placed a folded note on the frame. A teacher paused for a long time before continuing down the corridor. The sketchbook was never returned to the gallery. It remained in the care of the art center, tucked in a drawer among old exhibition posters and unused frames. But sometimes, Late in the day, one of the students would open it. They would turn the pages carefully past the city sketches, the sea and the branches, and pause at the final drawing. And in that simple gesture, Jiwon lived again. Not as a figure in the spotlight, not as a voice in the crowd, but as the quiet presence she had always been, tender, unspoken, and deeply felt.